Today we're going to go over manufacturing. Now, manufacturing is very vast, very deep, right? We're going to go over the top layers of manufacturing. There's so much more that can go into it. So we are going to we've picked out some more commonly used manufacturing functionality. And that's what we're going to go over today. But just keep in mind that there are a lot of other things, and we're just kind of scratching the surface here today. So with manufacturing, GoldFinch can handle, there are two different types of manufacturing. There's discrete manufacturing and also batch manufacturing. Discrete manufacturing is more of there's a finite list of components that are going in to create a finished good item. It's always the same, it doesn't generally fluctuate. So that's really what discrete is, that you're taking these components. For example, if you're creating a bike, you will take one frame, two pedals, two tires, and one handlebar, put them all together, and then you create one bike. And that's always going to be the same. Some of the components may change as to what type of tire, what size, but you're always going to be creating the same output. The other type of manufacturing is batch manufacturing. And that's when you're putting all components and you're generally mixing products together. Batch manufacturing usually comes that you're missing kind of foods or solutions into a big drum that you're then going to parse out later into smaller sellable or usable units of measure. Often with batch manufacturing, the output fluctuates and the input also fluctuates, being time of day, weather could change what components are being utilized and how many you need to use. So we're going to go through today both discrete and batch manufacturing. So you can kind of see how that all works together. All right, so now I'm going to look at the system, and there are a couple setup things that we're going to have. First is the warehouses. If I go into the warehouse, I'm going to be defining different bins. There are these 4 bins here. We have output bin and input bins. This is for discrete manufacturing. What bins are you going to be consuming the products from, the raw materials, and what bin are you going to be outputting that finished good into? So these are the default bins that are going to be populating. And then there's also output and input bins for batch manufacturing. So I have here for batch manufacturing, it's all going into a production bin. So basically I need all of my components to be in a production bin. I'm going to make my product and then output that product into the same production bin. And again, this can fluctuate, but you do need to pay attention to it. This is generally the default of where the goods are going to be and where you're going to put them once they're finished. Okay, now I'm going to go into the items so you can see the items and how these are set up. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into an item that's set up as batch manufacturing. So here I have this item that's chocolate batch, it's just what we've named it. This inventory class is a subassembly because once we create this whole big batch of chocolate, it's going to be utilized in other products. So this is going to be considered a subassembly in the manufacturing process. You can see here over to the right, I have my units of measure set up. I have a pound unit of measure, which is just standard. This is the standard base unit of measure as a pound. But then I also have a unit of measure, which is called a batch. And this batch consists of, here there's a conversion of 100, that's 100 pounds. So by setting this batch unit of measure up, I'm saying whenever I create a batch, I'm going to create a batch of 100 pounds. And that's how I'm going to be setting up my different formulas to be creating into this batch size. If I scroll down onto the item further, there's a whole section for manufacturing. I have this item flagged to be batch manufacturing. It just kind of changes a little bit of the functionality when you're utilizing, when you're creating a work order for this item. You can see here I have my default batch unit of measure. So that batch unit of measure that I created here, I'm just going to set up in here that's saying that this is my default. Whenever I create a work order for this item, it's going to be default to this batch size, which I've already set up as 100 pounds. Now you can have different batch sizes. So if one time depending on your drum size, maybe you can create 100 pounds in one drum size, but other times you might want to only create 75 pounds. So you can have multiple batches in here and multiple batch units of measure set up that you can be utilizing for when you're doing the manufacturing. But this here is going to be your default. So this is just going to be what your initial entry is when you create a work order. Now you can see here I also have these two different tolerance percentages. I have a batch output tolerance and a batch consumption tolerance. Generally, when you're doing batch manufacturing, you're not going to have an exact amount of products that you consume or that you output, right? Oftentimes it's going to be variations. So you can put in here a percentage that the system will allow you to go over or under, of course. You can always go under, but this will allow us to go over. And just to streamline the process so that you can, if you use a whole, if you use 50% more of the consumable items, the system's going to stop you and say there's a problem and to look into the problem before you go any further. Okay, I also have down here in the planning section, this replenishment system is set up as work order. If you are going to create a work order for any item, this replenishment system must say work order. Otherwise, you won't be able to create it to have this finished good product or this output product on the work order. Okay, so that's important. And here's the batch. And then what we also have is this section here for item formulas. And this is where I'm going to define what components or bills of materials are going to be utilized to create this output item. I'm just going to say view all here so we can see. So these are different items, the quantity per. So for each batch, I'm going to have 100 pounds of this cocoa powder that's going to be utilized and 2 pounds of water. So all of these are going to be mixed together. Now this is very simplistic, this batch item. It's just going to be utilizing two components. And what we're going to do is we're just going to mix those together in the work order, consume these products, and then output this batch item, this 70-10 item is going to be output. So this is very simplistic, but this is the basic setup of the batch item. Now we can have different versions of the item formulas of the components. I don't have any different versions set up, but just know that it is a possibility. So you can say when you create a work order, maybe you have different recipes that you might use, but it's going to be outputting basically the same thing and the same item. You can have different formula versions. You can set that up here, and that's just a code that you're going to assign. And it's just going to be how you can interpret what components are being utilized when a work order is being created. Now that we have our items basically set up, the next thing we're going to do is create a work order. And I'm going to create a work order for this chocolate cake. So we need to make so many chocolate cakes to have in stock. So I'm going to click on work orders here, and then I'm just going to click on new, and I'm going to enter the output item. Okay, and it's going to come up with unit of measure of cases. So I'm going to say, so by default, I have it set up that we're going to make so many cases at a time. And I'm going to say that I need to create 12 cases. You can see over here, the warehouse is main. The default output bin and input bins are defined here. You can change them if you want to on this work order, but I'll just keep them here. The main thing to know is this input bin is production. So that means all components need to be in the production bin in order to complete this work order. After I've entered my output item and quantity, all of the lines here on the work lines are being populated. The routing lines are populated, and also the formula lines are populated. So I can have my components in here. So these are the items that are being needed to produce these. And then here are my routings. Now, depending on how you have things set up, each routing might have a different starting and end date or time, depending on how, all the different configurations that you have. But you'll also see here that the expected quantity, So for all of these expected quantity, it's just taking my quantity and multiplying what we need for each case, and it's just calculating it. So
That's
I
nice.
have my work order created, so that's all I need to do to create the work order, and I'm just going to save this. And then once I have this created, I have a couple reports that I can print from here, right? One is I can print my work order pick ticket. So I can print this out, and this is going to say for this item, these are the components that I need. It's only telling me the components, and it's telling me how many I need and the quantity that I have available. Now you can see for this item, I don't have any available. This is one way to note that I do need to create this chocolate batch. I don't have any on hand. So in order to make a cake, I need this batch of chocolate to be created. So here's one way we have a pick ticket document. There are also different planning functionalities that can be utilized that would just kind of suggest saying, hey, in order to create this work order, you need to create another work order for that subassembly. And so that is what we're going to do now. We have this work order open. We cannot produce it because we don't have all the items. So what I'm going to do here is click on work orders, create a new work order, and I'm going to create a work order for my batch of chocolate. So it's going to come in here, the item, the unit of measure is batch, and how many batches am I going to create? So each batch that's creating is creating 100 pounds. I think I needed 360 in order to create that for that other work order that I have open. So I'm going to say here, I'm going to create 4 batches so that I have enough batches here. And that's going to create the total output is going to be 400 base units, which is 400 pounds. Okay, and then I have here also, I have the output bin and the input bin. It's defaulting from the setup of the warehouse, and I'm just going to change this. The output bin, I want to output it right into production because as soon as I make this, I'm going to use it in another work order. You can see here the lines down here are just going to have the components, and it's going to calculate how much we need of each of these components. So I'm going to save the work order, and then again, from this work order, I'm going to print my pick ticket again. So I'm going to see here on this pick ticket, here are all of the quantities of the components that I need, and here's the amount that I have available. So I have plenty out in-house that I can utilize to create this work order. All right, so now once we have this work order entered, the next step is once we have all of the components here, and I'm going to make this item, I'm going to create a production journal. And so the production journal, now there are different reports that you can run right from this work order that you can um, hand to the production floor to know, okay, this is what we need to create, and they're pulling the items, they're creating, putting the components together, and they're creating these different batches. Once that's all done, the next step that needs to happen is a production journal needs to be created. And what that does is that will consume the components and it'll create an output for that item that's being created. So if I click on create production journal here, it's just going to take the information that I have on the work order and it's going to create a production journal here. So if I just click on edit here to look at the production journal, it's a little bit easier to see. You can see here, this is my output item and the output quantity, right? So it's 4 batches that's going to be output into this production bin. And then here are the consumption lines and all of the different consumption quantities that's going to be consumed from the production bin. So here, if you need to make any changes, if for example, it didn't take 400 pounds, it actually took 405 pounds. We can change that quantity there. We can change the quantity of the water or of the output as well. So this is all fluctuates, it's all flexible. And this is because we have those different tolerance percentages set up. And so we can change the different quantities and then just click on save. And now what we're going to do is there are some items here, some components that have lot numbers. So I'm going to enter the consumption lot number of the items that we're going to be consuming. And here, I'm going to select the lookup so I can see what we have on hand. And you can see it's in the production bin. So I'm just going to select this item and that lot number for my 405 pounds. I'll save that so now I have that lot number selected. And then also this output batch also has a lot number. So I'm going to click on the edit again on the production journal, and I'm going to go to output tracking lines. So here I need to enter the lot number that I'm going to be assigning to this output item. So you can enter whatever lot number it is. And here you can see the unit of measure automatically defines to pounds. You can change this if you'd like, but in this case, we're going to output it into pounds. So it's going to finish out being 400 pounds. Again, if you need to change this, you can, if it fluctuates, you can, of course, change that quantity. But once everything's here, I'm going to click on save. And then the next step after you have your lot numbers entered is to post your production journal. So by clicking on post here, this is actually going to consume the raw material and then output the finished item. And I'm going to click here on ledger entries, and this is still in the production journal. Now this is an item journal, and it just has the journal type of production. You can see here in the ledger entries, these are the item ledger entries that were created. So we have our 2 items that were consumed at the quantities that I defined, and then the output item. So I have 400 pounds of this finished good item. I can also see that there are cost entries associated with all of this. And then there are general ledger entries. And you'll notice the general ledger entries is you're going to be crediting the raw materials that were taken out of inventory, and then you're going to debit a work in process general ledger account number. Because this work order is still open and it hasn't been completed yet. Once we finish it, then we're going to tell it that it's out of WIP and move the general ledger account number at that time. So from here, I'm back to the production journal. I can see here the related work order. So I'm just going to click on the related work order so I can see what's happened here after I posted the production journal. You can see here in the item journal section, here's a production journal that I had just created, and it was posted, and you can kind of relate it, go back and forth to that to see the information. You can see here on the ledger entries, we also have all of the item ledger entries and general ledger entries, cost entries associated with the work order as well. So they're all linked together. And then we can see here on the work order, we can see here's the total material cost in WIP and the finished good cost. So that's just kind of moving it over. So we only have material costs right here for this particular work order. Now, what I did is I created a work order for quantity 4 and I produced the entire quantity of 4. You can do this in piecemeal. So you can have multiple production journals, maybe 1 production journal for each batch. You can go through and do that and just continue to create production journal over and over again until the work order is completed. Or like I did here, we can just finish the entire quantity at one time. So that's an option depending on how the client actually works. But now once I have this work order finished, so I have my quantity completely finished, you do have to go through a process to select that you are finishing the work order. And what this is going to do, it's going to note that the work order has now been completed. You're not going to have any more transactions on it. And it's going to move the general ledger from WIP to that finished good item. So I'm just going to click on finish work order. And now here you can see if I look at the general ledger entries, you can see here the subassembly, the cost of the output was selected, but then, or I'm sorry, the subassembly is now debited for the total cost of the output. And then the WIP has zeroed itself out. So we've credited WIP. So that just kind of moves the cost out of WIP and into the subassembly general ledger account number that was defined on that item. Okay, you can also see here, there's an option here that's saying that this is from the finishing of the work order. So it kind of helps you differentiate the general ledger and account numbers that are or general ledger entries that are being created so that you know that this is from the finished work order so that you know that this has been actually finished and completed. And that now it should be completely removed out of WIP. All right, so we've produced this item, and I'm going to go to this item now. So now, if I go right to this item and look at the bin content, I can see that we have 400 pounds in the production bin, which is what we wanted, right? We needed this item to create that finished good work order. So now if I go back to the other work order that I have here, that I just created for the cake itself, if I create my work order pick ticket, you can see here the same quantity needed, but now I have my available quantity and it's ready. Now I'm ready for this work order and I can start producing the work order. Now, there are a couple ways. Now, I happen to know that this item, that batch item, was in the production bin, right? And then another item that's needed for this work order is this, what is this, packaging item. If I look at my item ledger entries, or yes, my bin content, I can see that I have the quantity available, but it's not in the production bin. It's in the pick bin. So I'm going to have to move the inventory from the pick bin and move it into the production bin so I can actually make that work order. There are a few different ways you can do this. Obviously, you're going to print the production work order pick ticket to give to someone to say, all right, go out and find these items, bring them in, and then we're going to have to move them into the production bin because everything needs to be in the one bin in order to produce the work order. There are a couple ways we can do this. One is you can create pick tickets directly from a work order. So you can come in here, click on create pick, which is the same as a pick ticket that's created from a sales order. So you can create a pick ticket and it's a whole new document and you can post the pick ticket and that would move the inventory from one bin to another. We have another option as well that you can just create a movement. So you could manually create a movement, right? Just from bin to move the inventory without going through an entire new document of creating a pick ticket document. So if I select here from the list of work orders, this is the work order that I'm working on right now. And I can select here, create replenishment movement. And this will automatically go out to all the consumed items, create a movement journal for me that will move the inventory from whatever bin it's in into the production bin. So if I click on create replenishment movement, you can see here, these are the two component items. Now you can do this for many work orders at one time or just this one work order. I'm just going to do this one work order. It's easier to see. So you can see here, it's listing, these are all of the components that I need. Here's the quantity of each of these components that are in the input bin that's needed. So here, this batch of chocolate is in the input bin. I don't need to move anything. But here, this packaging item, I don't have any in the input bin, so I do need to move 144 from whatever bin it's in into the production bin. So I'm just going to click on Create Movement, and this is just going to create a movement warehouse activity that's going to move the item from the pick bin to the production bin. So this function is just doing this automatically for you instead of you manually entering the movement. And I'm just going to post this, and that's going to move my inventory into where that I need it so that I can actually produce that work order. Okay, so now that item is in the bin that I need it to be in. So now if I go back to my work order, I'm ready. All of the components are in the production bin for me. They've all been moved. The entries have been processed. And now I can go to the next step is I can click on create production journal. Now, because there are multiple steps happening here, you can do this in a couple of different ways. You can create the production journal first, or you can send the item out if you need any outside services. You can create a purchase order for that. It kind of depends on the situation, what's going to happen first, but it's interchangeable which one happens first. So I'm just going to click on create production journal. And what this is going to do, it's going to move all of those items. Here, let me click on edit. It's going to consume the items that I have here, right? The raw material items, and it's going to create the finished good item. You can also see that there are these two routing lines here. This is what's happening internally. So when I do the production journal, it's not going to actually consume the inventory items because these aren't These are work centers, they're not actual items, but it's going to consume the cost. So it's going to create the cost because I do have costs associated with these two lines, and it's going to update the cost of my finished good item, as well as the components that are being utilized. So here, because I do have need a lot number, I'm going to enter my output lot number here. So I do need a lot number. And then I'm going to define what unit of measure I'm outputting the item. I can output it into cases or I can output it into eaches. Because I sell in eaches, I'm just going to say that I'm going to output into actual eaches. So you can change the unit of measure. I can say, for example, I'm going to output into one case and then go to a different line and enter different eaches. So you can kind of mix and match how you're going to actually output your finished good item. In this case, I'm just going to do all eaches. I'm going to do 144 eaches out, and that's how it's going to be sitting in my inventory. But you do have a lot of options. Now, this particular item only had 2 different units of measure, but if you have multiple units of measure, you can have as many lines as you need here just to define how the quantities are being output. Okay, so once I have here, I have my output tracking line and unit of measure here. And then I'm also on this production journal going to enter my consumption lots, what I'm consuming here. Okay, now if I post this production journal, what's going to happen here, if I look at my item ledger entries that were created, I have my consumption of the raw material quantities, and then I have 2 output lines because they're on 2 different units of measure. So the grand total of everything has been output, but we've just broken it down into cases and eaches. So now this is how it's sitting in your inventory, a couple cases and 100 or so, 120 eaches. And then what we also have is our general ledger entries that are being created. You can see here the work in process is all of the costs rolled up into the WIP account. We have our different raw materials, right? Here, this is the cost of the subassembly that we've created, that batch. Here's the cost of the raw materials that were being utilized. And here's the cost of those routing, so that the cost of the processes are being reflected here as well. And all of them roll up into what we have in work in process. So I'm going to go back to the work order, and then we're going to see those same lines, right? All of the item ledger entries, the general ledger entries that were associated with the production journal. And then also you can see here we have that one production journal. And now if I come down here to the costing of this finished good item, it's going to be broken down. Here's the material in WIP, right? Those are the components that were being utilized. And here's the service capacity in WIP as well. So it's just breaking these 2 accounts down, and then you're going to get your total finished cost as of this moment. This work order isn't finished yet. It's still open, and we're not going to finish it yet because we still have this step to send this item to an outside service that they're going to charge us money to decorate this cake. So you can see here the line status. All of the lines have been finished except for this one item. We still have an open status here. And now with this work order, what we're going to do is we're going to create a purchase order that we're going to send to a vendor and actually pay the vendor to decorate this cake for us. In order to do that, I'm going to click on Insert Requisition. So I'm going to say Insert Requisition Lines. And now, because of how this item was set up, because it's a work order and an outside service, those are the only lines that this function is going to look for on a work order. Only outside service lines. So you can see this one item, the quantity, right? Because we created 144 eaches. We have a unit cost. We're going to actually create a purchase order. On this item, I have a default vendor set up, so that's why the vendor's coming in here, but I can, override that if I'd like. And then I can just say, I'm going to create the purchase order from here. So if I click on Create Purchase Order, going to say that it's created, one purchase order has been created. And here I'm going to have my purchase order link here. So I'm just going to click on the purchase order. And this is just a standard purchase order that's being created. If you can look here, I have just that one item of this service item, right, to decorate the outside of the cake. I can do whatever I want to this purchase order and change the costs if you need to. And you can create and send this purchase order out to the vendor. You can have whatever information you want on here. You'll notice how by default the purchase order is relating back to the work order. So this is helpful in some instances. Some you may want to change the description, but so we're going to be able to say that for a specific work order and a finished good item, this is all this information is given to the vendor. So can I kind of help them to know what they need to do? All right, and then we're gonna, once the vendor's finished the work that they've done on this, they're gonna invoice us and we can create the vendor's invoice right from here. We don't have to do anything else with the purchase order. So we're just gonna create the invoice once they have the items back and they send us an invoice for how much it's gonna cost us. We can create the vendor's invoice and you can see here that there's a cost associated. So this cost is going to be rolled up into that finished good item. So I'm going to post the purchase order. So I have an additional $720 that's being added to those finished goods work order. Okay, so now from here, if I go back to the work order, and this is the work order that I was on, we'll be able to see here the capacity cost got increased. And that, is calculating into the finished good cost as well. And we can also see on the work lines for this item, for the decoration of the cake, that line status has now been finished. So that's been finished. It's updated the cost, and it's also created an additional general ledger entry for this outside service. So we have now work in process for this outside service. So now you'll see that $720 there. So here we are back to the work order. So now we have a lot of things happen, right? We consumed the item. We have costs for these routing lines, right? The internal routing lines. And we also have the costs for the outside service that was done. So now once everything's been done and the vendor's invoice has been posted, we can finish this work order. Because oftentimes that's what you're going to be waiting for. If you have an outside service, you kind of have to wait for the vendor to say, yes, this is done. This is the final cost. Because when you finish the work order, you're saying everything's been finalized. And finishing the work order will now move the general ledger account out of WIP and move it to that finished good. We go here. So if I look here, these two were just created. So we moved the entire cost of everything that's happened, the components and the services, out of WIP. And we've moved that into finished good because now we're saying that is completely final. All of the costs have been accounted for. And this is the finished, the cost of the final finished good. Yeah, so I kind of think that I went through the most common situations, right? Where you have your components, obviously, your internal routings and your external routings. External routings, I just did very, very basic. There's also options where you can send components out and to your vendor and get them sent back in. And that's just, a whole lot more setup, really, but it's the same basic idea where you're going to be creating a purchase order for your vendor. And really what you want to do is get everything back and get the costs back so that you can update your work order. There are quite a few things that happens on the work order. And from the work order list, we do have some batch functions that can happen. So you can go through this and maybe at the end of the month, go through and see what's still open and batch finish a whole bunch of them. So if you want to finish a whole bunch of work orders, you can go and do that in a batch. You can reopen them after you finish it. You can reopen it. You can create production journals, which is this batch produce. So if you have a lot of work orders and you want to create multiple production journals, you can do that in mass. You can also insert requisition lines. I only did that one work order for requisition, but you might have multiple work orders that you have to send to the same vendor. And you can get all of that information onto one purchase order. So you have one purchase order with multiple work orders. If that's the case, you can come here, select all of whatever work orders you want to, create a requisition for, and just say insert requisition in mass here. And then we also have these two options. depending on how you're going to replenish your inventory into your production bin, you can either create pick tickets, and it's how your system's set up. If you're set up to create pick tickets, then you would utilize this function. If not, then you would just utilize a replenishment journal, which just moves the inventory. But here you can do that in mass as well. So if you have a few work orders here that, haven't started yet, you can either create pick tickets or create the replenishment movement for multiple work orders at one time.